Is Democratic representative from California's 28th District and member of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, Congressman Adam Schiff, and MSNBC counterterror analyst and former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Michael Leiter. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time in what is a very busy week. Congressman, let me start with you. You have said members of the Intelligence Committee have been briefed on the Khorasan group for some time. What does some time mean?
Well, it's certainly been months and months. We were aware for a long time, really since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, that elements of Al-Qaeda were operating out of Syria, that posed not only a threat to the region, but a threat to us in the homeland. But it's certainly been many months that we've been briefed about this specific threat, where you have core Al-Qaeda figures coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, teaming up with bomb makers of AQAP in Yemen, and posing a very direct threat to our aircraft, to our homeland. Many of us in a veiled way have been saying, let's not lose sight of the most immediate threat to the country, which is not from ISIS, but from groups like Khorasan.
Michael, if this has been on the bubble, as they say, for this many months, were the alarm bells ringing in the same way months ago? Or has Khorasan become a greater danger in the same way that ISIS has become a greater danger over the course of the last few months?
I think largely it's been about the same threat, but progressing. And I think the intelligence community has been watching it very closely. And honestly, I think it's a very good news story that the American public didn't know about this. It's appropriate that the American public knew that there was a homeland threat that the congressman very responsibly spoke about. But we don't actually want the public to know the name of the group. We don't want the public to know some of those details, because that would have undermined the intelligence community's ability to target them as they did in the last couple of days. So this is a good news story. You talk generally about the threat, but you're not disclosing details about it that will undermine the ability to use lethal action, because the threat had really advanced over the past several months.
Well, let's talk about who Khorasan represents, because some folks, and BuzzFeed has a story saying today, U.S. goes to war with Al-Nusra. Khorasan is the sort of international wing affiliated with Al-Nusra, which is the domestic wing of terrorism, or not terrorism, but it is a domestic front in Syria. And there are some folks that say we should not be battling. There are some moderate Syrian forces that say we should not be at war with Al-Nusra at this moment in time. By virtue of bombing Khorasan, we are going to war with Al-Nusra. Do you agree with that, and what do you make of it?
I don't agree with it, but it just shows the difficulty and complexity of the situation in Syria. Yes, there are rebel groups that are upset with us for going after the Khorasan group because they make league with al-Nusra from time to time in fighting the regime. Their number one priority is fighting the regime. Our number one priority is protecting our country, which means going after ISIS and going after groups like Khorasan and Al-Qaeda. And al-Nusra is the official Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria.
Yeah.
So we have overlapping objectives, but we don't have exactly the same priorities, and that's why this is going to be a real challenge.
Let me just follow up on something Michael said about the American public not knowing about Khorasan, and that is a good thing. While that's understandable from a counterterrorism perspective, I wonder, in terms of being a member of Congress, being an elected representative of the American people, is it a good thing for the American people not to understand what threats are posed to them, and those threats, which threats will be taken out in a sort of wartime military operation? You know,
it's a very difficult balance to walk. As Mike was saying, we want to bring the country into the conversation about what threats we face. At the same time, if we give too many specifics, then we cause these people to go to ground. We cause them to change how they communicate with each other. If we know certain things about them and that becomes public, they can piece together, okay, they must have access to our communications or other ways of identifying us or locating us. So that balance is tough to strike, but I think we did a pretty good job. I was just having a conversation with Matt Olson of the Counterterrorism Center literally days ago saying, if there is an attack on the homeland from Al-Qaeda or from this Khorasan group, the American people are going to say, did we take our eye off the ball by focusing so much on ISIS? So that is something that, we have been discussing, strategizing on, and trying to make sure that we draw the line in the right place in terms of public information.
Well, this seems like terrorism is, I think, by nature in the century sort of a hydra. There are multiple heads, and Michael, we have news this hour of beheadings happening to a French citizen who was beheaded in Algeria, German tourists who have disappeared in the Philippines. So it's not just necessarily even about the terrorist groups in the Mideast. It could be terrorist cells in the Philippines. And from your perspective, how combatable is this even?
This is why the problem is especially hard right now. And it's so confusing to Americans. Khorasan, ISIS, ISIL. The fact is, we face a real directed threat from the Khorasan group in Syria. You also have the potential for ISIL sending Western operatives. But this more diffuse threat of individuals being radicalized and taking action into their own hand under the flag of ISIL because they've been inspired by ISIL's message is a real challenge. We see it in Algeria, we see it in the Philippines, and God forbid, we have to try to prevent it in the United States and the West. But that self-generating, motivated by ISIS but not directed by ISIS is the hardest thing for the counterterrorism community to face.
Congressman, I have to ask you, because you've been a fierce and vocal proponent of reauthorizing, or saying that Congress needs to take a vote to reauthorize the use of military force. It feels like there is more momentum behind a reauthorization of AUMF, which doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually happen in Congress. What's the likelihood that anything gets done before the end of this year, before the lame duck session?
I think the momentum is really irresistible that we'll have a vote in the lame duck session. Many of us feel we shouldn't have recess to begin with. Yeah. We should be called into session again.
You are in Washington, it must be noted.
Well, yes. It's astounding to me that at a time of war, the Congress is adjourned for elections rather than authorizing the president to use force necessary to protect the country. I think that momentum is really building. The leadership in the Senate, I think, is behind it. There's a growing body of members in the House that are demanding it. And this is, I fear, a abdication of constitutional dimension. The fact that all is basically a vote to approve funding for one piece of the president's strategy, not the broad war effort. And given that this is going to last years, you really need the country behind it, and the way to ensure that that opinion doesn't flip on a dime is to make sure their representatives are as well wedded to the effort. So there are important practical reasons to take up a vote as well.
Do you think any responsibility for that in terms of upholding constitutional principles lies on the president's shoulder for not seeking directly approval from Congress and the American people in doing this?
Yes, it's a shared responsibility. The president should have come to Congress for an authorization. But failing that, we can't lay this entirely at the White House doorstep. There's nothing preventing the Congress on its own from taking up this issue. We should have. In fact, we have the greater interest at stake. It's our institutional responsibility in the Constitution to declare war. And if we abdicate because we're waiting for that call from the White House, it's going to be future Congresses that are diminished. Our role as a check and balance will be diminished. So, yes, the president has a role he should have undertaken, but I place most responsibility on the shoulders of Congress itself.
It is good to see you. I am glad that you are in Washington, one of the few members of Congress who is here talking and thinking about the matter at hand. Congressman Adam Schiff from California, thank you so much for your time.